I would like from this point to open the floor to questions. I think that we couldn't have better panelists than we have today. I would like also to acknowledge that Professor Lipstadt came especially for this panel from Columbus, Ohio, and from Atlanta, and James especially flew in from Toronto. I would like also to acknowledge that in this room we have now representatives from some 45 diplomatic missions, people from academia, and I'm especially very happy to see so many young people participating in this debate. And just to emphasize once again that this is probably the internal culture of the organization that we are facing now, that this debate even takes place at this time, and it's another opportunity really to commend the ICRC on having this open debate. So please, if there are questions from the floor, just please present yourself.
Yes, my name is Alex Dembitz and I live in Geneva. The international system is broken. It doesn't really work, does it? When the world doesn't have any means of stopping genocide. So it's astonishing what Médecins Sans Frontières does, what the International Committee does. But it's like closing the barn door after the horse has bolted. It's not in this forum, of course, that anyone can hope to repair the international system. But people are dying day and day throughout the world. Genocide goes on throughout the world. And because the United Nations system is as it is, we are running after ourselves. This is a tall order, but a question. What can be done?
There is no one recipe on what can be done. I agree that what we are witnessing at the present moment and in the past couple of years, and which translates into more humanitarian needs, displacements, violations of law, is also a reflection, I agree, that the international system and the institutions we have created are not able at the present moment to cope with the number of problems and to contain and to ensure respect of some of the laws and conventions which have been agreed beforehand. The question is actually not one to ask a humanitarian operator. I can tell you what we do in mitigating the effects of this situation. The question is, what can we do in where we live in order to generate political consensus, political will, in order to address some of those problems? And I think that's the approach which we have to take. On the other side, from the humanitarian side, what we can do is try to inject some elements of stability into a world which is out of control and into societies which are deeply destabilized. That's what humanitarian action can do. Prevent even worse. When we do what we do in Syria, it's one of the biggest operations. It's prevention of having more refugees drown in the Mediterranean. If we try to scale up and to tirelessly negotiate access into places of Iraq and to cope with all those impacts of violence that we have, it's trying to prevent worse, to mitigate effects, to stabilize and to bring some minimal livelihoods and life back to societies so that they can reconstitute themselves. And if I may be a little bit more pointed, I think if I may also criticize the angle that you take, I think we have also to ask the question what works and to build and scale up what works. It's not that we live in a world where everything is a failure. There are things that work, we just need more of it. We need critical mass in order to have it known. We need to improve and whatever, but I think it's important that we do not just call on big politics to set the stage and to fix the issues. There is a lot that can be done bottom up. This is a culturally still a very Swiss organization. And this means that we believe strongly in reconstituting and constituting political life bottom up, and trying to stabilize and to bring normalcy to society by generating consensus at the bottom and not necessarily at the top. That's our methodology. That's what we offer. That's what we try to do and to contribute, and more of it wouldn't harm.
Your observation is quite correct. I mean, we have essentially 20th century institutions that were designed for 20th century, mid-20th century reality being used and as the remnant institutions in a 21st century world. So we clearly do need reform. We also have moved from a bipolar to a unipolar and now to a multipolar world. And you're absolutely right that there are forms of crisis, not simply in humanitarianism, but in energy policy, climate change, food security, international financial stability, and on and on and on. But I think what can be done? I think the first thing, the most important thing, is to recognize the scope of your responsibility, of your sphere, of your domain, and not try to enter into all other domains. And in the scope of humanitarianism, I think there is no other organization that has the moral authority that the ICRC has, and the practical and the operational and the political skill that the ICRC has. And that said, I think we really are at a point where initiative is the answer. So we have to try different things. We have to generate a range of experiments and look to see which one or which some take hold. And I think just to again emphasize the great idea that you're developing inside the ICRC, this idea of humanitarian diplomacy, I think this is a very, very important initiative. And it could be coupled with other initiatives like creating multiple platforms to explore the meaning, for example, of Islamic conceptions of humanitarianism and humanitarian law, and actually bringing that to the public domain, not simply for the West or for non-Islamic communities, but also for the Islamic community, so that they themselves become part of the normative process that actually contains the wrong that is very clearly being evidenced through, for example, ISIL. And so initiative, I think, is the critical idea. And in doing so from a number of different perspectives, with a view to creating experiments to see what takes hold. And the effect of that can be quite catalytic in other domains that aren't within the domain of, for example, the humanitarian.
Can I just give one example for this, because you mentioned humanitarian law and Islam, and I think this is typical an area where ICRC over the last 10 years, because of our operational exposure in the Islamic world, has engaged a lot. And what is it all about? I mean, it is about translating into other value systems what has been framed and generated by the Geneva Conventions. And it's quite advanced what we have done in many of the society, and I give you one practical example which illustrates what you say, James. We have worked with a lot of Islamic clerics to find the adequacy of Islamic law and the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law. And we managed through our diplomacy also to get in contact with leading Islamic scholars, in this case Shia scholars, the Ayatollah al-Sistani in Najaf, and he was absolutely operational to open us doors to talk to Shia fighters in Iraq about international humanitarian law and their behavior in the battlefield. It just shows that it's typical one of those issues of translation, of combination of knowledge of the law, of spreading the law, of using the law in terms of a diplomatic initiative and trying to enter doors or to crack walls which are still fixed. And it's an interesting example. Many more could be told. But I agree with you that it's good to work in the area where you are and to try to figure out what kind of initiatives have the clout of changing the tide. We don't need to create a perfect world, but we have to change the tide.
My name is Dr. Hieronymi. I was 6 years old when my grandfather was taken off the street on March 19th when the Germans arrived in Budapest, and that was one step in the extermination of the Jews in Hungary. Then I lived in Hungary under the communist system. My father, my aunts went through prison, and in 1956 I was fortunate enough to arrive in Switzerland as a refugee. And I'm saying this because I've had the benefit of the worst and the best of what the 20th century has to offer. And the 20th century is a century of paradox. And unfortunately, this has not come out clearly enough in all the speeches. That is to say, we have seen the worst. The word communism was not mentioned, but that's how it started. And it has gone on. And it was a reaction to all these bad things that have allowed us to construct the world of freedom and respect for human rights as a reaction to all these horrors. So what is important is that it's ideas and values that come first. And I think that is where we cannot make any compromises. And I think this is also partly of the task of all the organizations that are represented here. But this message has to be clear. It's not the politicians, it's the people who have to be aware that there is a need for solidarity, a word that unfortunately was not mentioned tonight. Thank you very much.
I agree. I'm not sure I agree fully and say that we've seen the best. I think if we speak about solidarity and we speak about the improvements, we can do so only by looking at a limited part of the world, by not looking at ISIS, at Syria, at Afghanistan, and other places. But I do think you were right on the point of there was a moment, and it started with the Nuremberg tribunals, imperfect as they were, and then the Genocide Convention, imperfect as it is, where the world seemed for a moment to step back and realize and recognize what has happened. I think that maybe to add a third chapter, you talked about the worst, you talked about the best. I think right now what we're seeing and why so many of us are so deeply disturbed is because we seem to see a shattering of some of those consensuses that came out of the worst. They seem to be disintegrating. They seem not capable of addressing the violence that we're seeing in today's world. So I think it's a continuum, and we're possibly right now at the...
What you said earlier about the behavior of the French government and well, as all official organizations during the war, I fully agree with what you said. But I'm here because many individuals in France behaved well and properly, saved my families on both sides. And I think it's important to mention that, of course, officially and most organizations did very poorly during the war. And on an individual level, many people were very brave and courageous and saved Jews. I had a question. I feel that the way Hamas behaved during the Gaza conflict in August was not denounced properly by international organizations, international communities, and particularly by journalists everywhere. I think a consequence of this is first an increase in anti-Semitism in Europe because people see the conflict presented in a either biased way against Israel, either in a too partial way to try to maintain a balance. I think probably most of the people here know, but probably not everybody knows, that Hamas had used hospital to hide a command center, had used, of course, schools to store weapons, has fired missiles from more or less everywhere, houses, schools, hospitals, towards civilians, and has therefore violated all kind of humanitarian laws and all kind of laws of wars without being denounced properly enough. I think it has huge consequences because, of course, it seems now normal to use human shields in a conflict. It's more or less normal to target civilians. And of course, the major consequence for all of us here living in Europe is an increase in anti-Semitism. So what would you think about this?
The easy questions going to Peter Maurer. We'll ask him to respond to this.
I'm not going to comment on the behavior of the one or the other party in the Gaza conflict, and this is maybe a good opportunity to illustrate a little bit where even today, and I emphasized several times tonight that just advocacy and communication and public policy is not the only form and format which an organization like mine is going to follow. As long as diplomacy has the chance to change behavior, if diplomacy and quiet engagement allows us to make progress, we should give diplomacy a chance. What I can say here in that concrete case, we are engaging with the Israeli government, we are engaging with Hamas on what happened last summer in the Gaza Strip, and we are, as we do it with many other governments in the world, we are making recommendations, we are following up on recommendations, and we would hope that this changes the behaviors of the parties to conflict. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to tell you we are considering each and every day 100 times on whether what we are confronted with is wood for quiet engagement and try to change behavior, whether it necessitates public engagement, whether it is necessary to trespass, as Cornelio has said, the framework of the law, and to speak to values and ethics. And so my indirect response is I'm not going to respond.
The last question or remark to the President Loder.
First of all, what we have in the world today, and I spoke about it, is silence. People can kill, people can behead people can do different things, and the world is silent. I was in Jerusalem last year when a Catholic priest came to me. He told me they just escaped from just outside of Baghdad, and he left 50 children there who was in a Catholic school. And when ISIS came in, they asked the children, would they change to become Muslims? And they said no, and they beheaded all 50 children. I said, that's horrible. What happened? He said, silence. There are two things. One, the world is silent, and it's continuing to be silent. We read about 200,000 people being killed in Syria. The first 100,000 you read about in the newspapers, the last 100,000, nothing happens. And secondly, there is no sheriff. The UN, which is supposed to be there, is ineffectual, and there is no governing body that is able to stop these people. They pay no price. And when they pay no price, you mentioned Rwanda. They paid no price. They killed 1 million people and paid no price. There was no organization that could stop them. And we're seeing that over and over again. You basically have the United States, which at one time was the world sheriff, has pulled back from that. And you have a part where there's no country or no organization that can stop killing. If you drive from here and you go through a red light, you have three things happen. First of all, you're breaking the law and the chances are that you might get a ticket. Number two, you may get killed by another car coming. And number three, the chances are that people will know what you did and comment on it. There's no red lights in the world today, and silence happens. And the ICRC can do many things, and diplomacy sometimes works, but it doesn't work in this case. Diplomacy would not have worked to stop Nazi Germany. It would not save the Tutsis. It would not save the people in Syria or these 50 children from being beheaded. What do you do? It's a real question, and you have today a world without any policemen watching it. That's the happy note.
Thank you. I would like to thank the speakers and maybe to say a few words on behalf of the World Jewish Congress. We just came, like President Loder mentioned, from the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of Bergen-Belsen. And this panel is, among other things, a tribute to those who were killed there, and the open discussion that we are engaged here is really a tribute also to them. I think it's only symbolic that the first public event of the World Jewish Congress, coming back to Geneva and reopening its office in Geneva, is within the premises of the ICRC. And I would like once again to thank you very much for this. As President Loder said, World Jewish Congress took upon itself not to be silent. He is speaking on behalf of the Jewish communities worldwide. All of us are speaking on behalf of the Jewish communities worldwide on different atrocities happening in different places in the world, in order for what happened 70 years ago won't happen again. It includes also the situation in Iran. It includes different atrocities happening worldwide. Discussions such as this one held this evening are very, very important. On the one hand, they allow us to reflect on the past, but on the other hand, they also force us to look towards the future, and many of these things were discussed today, and I believe this is only the beginning of this discussion.
I thank columnists and panelists for all what they brought to us tonight, and to me particularly, because I learned a lot. You may be interested, after having been quoted by several of you, why it came that I made this statement on the 25th, I think it was January 95, in Krakow, before going to Auschwitz. I should perhaps say that as a child, I was very much impressed by the consequences of the Holocaust in Italy. My father worked at the Swiss legation in Rome, and he tried to save several friends, Jews, in our apartment. When I later on did meet my future wife, I learned that this Italian family on the Lake of Lugano was working very much to pass Jews from Italy to Switzerland on the seaside in the night. This is to give you a certain background. When I came to the ICRC, I was confronted on my desk with the book of Jean-Claude Favet that you all know, that had been made a study on the basis of archives of the ICRC. And I had to react. I had to react institutionally. And I did that, and there is even a letter signed by me in the first edition of the book of Favet, where I was somewhat critical in the way in which he approached the matter. But I was not satisfied personally. And I had in petto always the wish to come out with a certain statement. Those that know me from the time as my presidency of the ICRC know that I was a very outspoken president, and that I took a position in many situations, and that I was several times called to order by my different colleagues and collaborators because they were saying I was putting in danger our delegates in the field. However, the visits that I made at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, at Yad Vashem, at Wiener Library in London, had convinced me that I couldn't continue to be silent. And the occasion came when at this meeting convened by Lech Walesa, president of Poland, where head of states of those countries that have their nationals in Auschwitz were invited, that there was a terrible confusion, and there were two papers circulating, no simultaneous translation, and I thought I could perhaps help them. But in that moment, I knew that I couldn't simply speak about the papers without coming out what I had in petto. And this is the reason why, at that occasion, I made the statement that you have quoted perfectly, that was not prepared at all. I had no authority to do it in the name of the committee. I did put some words on the paper when I spoke. But this shows you something, and I would like to insist on that also because of something that my friend and successor, Peter Maurer, said. This is the moral part of the responsibility of the ICRC. I am a lawyer, and when I started the ICRC, I had my devise, my motto was constancy, rigorousness, and humility. Rigorousness was, look at the international humanitarian law. You should always go in this direction. No, in the practice, I understood that I had to go further than the law, that there are certain situations where you have to speak out without looking at the details of the law. And this is what I did at that occasion, but in several other occasions, particularly in the Yugoslav conflict. Here, dear friends, some news I give you from what was my motivation at that time, and very glad that I did that in '95.
And obviously we are very grateful to you that the moral authority surpassed the legal authority.
You started with, and you started by saying that you grew up in Italy, your father was a diplomat, and he tried to save, your parents tried to save some Jews in their home, and then when you met your wife, she came from the same source. So I would just point out that while there are institutional forces that shape us who we are, it also begins within the homes and the models we see within the homes that we are all raised in. So maybe part of the answer, of course the institutions have to function, but if it doesn't start at home, then I'm not sure the institutions can really address the situation. So I thank you for that especially.
We just came, like President Loder mentioned, from the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of Bergen-Belsen. And this panel is, among other things, a tribute to those who were killed there, and the open discussion that we are engaged here is really a tribute also to them. I think it's only symbolic that the first public event of the World Jewish Congress, coming back to Geneva and reopening its office in Geneva, is within the premises of the ICRC. And I would like once again to thank you very much for this.